Okay, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to get in front of you guys and cover this topic here. We're going to switch gears a little bit today and talk a little bit more about corn than we have. So I don't know if anybody feels qualified, but after the last presentation, if somebody wants to lead us in a prayer, or anything like that, that would make me feel better. I didn't know whether to buy ammunition or go to church or build a bunker. I didn't know what to do, so yeah, I'll do all the above and we'll try to get through it. But I did enjoy that. So with that, we'll get started. And so I always like to keep things very informal, so feel free to interrupt me at any time if you disagree with what I have to say or would like to chat about it. We'll do that. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about corn and some strategies to use to try to mitigate some of these things that we've heard about. And a lot of the things we'll talk about go hand in hand with what we've heard other speakers talk about today as well. So, not to continue any doom and gloom, but it's no secret that we all know that well capacities have declined over the years. Aquifer has declined over the years, and more so in some areas than others. I think one thing that's very interesting is that across our region of the high plains in general, we're pretty efficient in the fact that upwards of 20% of the corn crop in the U.S. is grown on about 15% of those acres. And so we're very efficient, highly productive on a lot of our acres out here. But once again, we've got to figure out how to do more with less. And I think that's what today has been all about at the general rule of thumb. So we're going to talk about some things, whether it be irrigation strategies or just general management, fertility, a few different pieces that may help us do that as far as corn is concerned. So where should our heads be at? Things that come to the forefront of my mind whenever we know that we're not going to have the water that we would like to. And I think that's just about every year, other than parts of last year whenever we had, in some cases, more than we wanted at one particular time, which can cause some challenges. But be thinking about things as far as how does our crop respond to water? We know that corn is going to respond differently to water than milo will or than a cotton crop will. And by knowing those things, we can manage our water more appropriately, specifically knowing about those growth stages, what's going on at a particular growth stage. As we heard Brent talk about earlier, panicle initiation starting at a certain growth stage, and we need to make sure we're taking care of that grain sorghum crop. Same goes for cotton, also for corn. We need to know about what's going on in that plant physiologically that we don't want to mess up with when we want to baby it, take care of it if we can. We heard about differences in irrigation practices and obviously want to be as efficient as possible. Making sure that our efficiencies are very high, moving towards more LEPA strategies, drip zones, things like that. Just things that we can do management-wise to get more bang for our buck out of the water we apply. And then how can we change some of our agronomic practices to fit those situations and to better manage our crop, regardless of what kind of crop it is. So in this part of the world, we drag a lot of steel through the ground, and for good reason in some cases, and for not so good a reason in other cases. And I think it's no mystery that residue on top of the ground will help us conserve moisture, whether that's from overhead sprinkler irrigation or whether that's from a rainfall event. So anything we can do to try to keep cover on that ground is going to be beneficial to us. And the more residue we've got out there, the less erosion we're going to have, the more water infiltration we'll have, and things like that. And some studies that were done at the University of Nebraska show that standing crop residues can account for nearly 2 additional inches of water in that soil compared to bare ground. So some of that may be due to better infiltration. Some of that may be due predominantly to runoff. If we get a heavy rain event all at one time, 2 inches in 45 minutes, we've got residue out there, hopefully we'll capture more of that. And in years where we do get a lot of those heavy rainfall events, it's been documented that we can capture up to 4 inches more soil moisture than we had if it was bare ground. So oftentimes we think, well, that's great, but I know whenever you're looking at a very critical time period in a plant's life, such as the flowering period in any crop, it sure be nice to have 2 more inches of water or 4 more inches of water to be able to bank on and utilize in our irrigation strategy. So when we talk about pre-plant irrigation, right now I feel like across a wide majority of the high plains and through the area that I cover, we're sitting pretty good as far as the soil profile goes, and that's a blessing that we've got right now to have some stored soil moisture, and hopefully that'll continue and we can start off the season with a full tank there and we can manage appropriately. But in those years where we don't and we try to do things like pre-water, we know that we're not always very efficient in doing so. And that may be a lot due to temperature. We heard earlier all the things that affect our efficiencies of water, whether it's high wind, which we've got a lot of in this part of the world, potentially high temperatures, clear days, and things like that. We're not always as efficient as we want to, especially whenever we are spraying that water out there in spray bug versus something like a LIPA and bubbling that on there. So some things we can do there. So as we get into more specifics about the corn crop, on average, we range somewhere between 15 to 32 inches of water needed per season. So 32 sounds pretty high. That would obviously be something like 100% ET replacement, giving that crop everything we've got, everything that it needs, if we had the amount of water to do that. But on average, somewhere around 22, 25 inches is a pretty good amount to shoot for very good yields of corn. And obviously, our breeders and our researchers are working on things where we get more yield per inch of water applied every day. That's a big task at hand for us to bring you better products. But the highlighted line up here is something I want to draw your attention to, and it's really no different from what we've heard in the other crops today. Upwards of 50% of that water is needed during the reproductive time period. So whenever we are shedding pollen and silking, very critical time period in that corn crop's life, and it's going to be using more water than it has prior, and then it will in the future. So that's one of those time periods where we definitely want to keep things happy. Peak use in our part of the world, on average, probably 3,500 a day during that time period. But if it's a year like 2011 and it is hot and it is windy, we've seen those bump up to 0.45, even 0.5 in some areas, and so I'm sure it can probably get even a little bit higher than that depending on wind speed, like humidity and temperature. So looking at corn growth and development, just a little bit of a review here of what's going on in that corn plant's life, and this is a very quick and dirty model, but just to highlight this, obviously, point number A, emergence in that corn crop's life. Getting on to more of a V6, when I say V6, 6 true collars on that corn plant. A lot's going on in that corn plant in that particular time period. That's one of those critical time periods, in my opinion, because we're determining how many rows around, how many kernels around that ear are going to be developed around that time period. And so that's something that if we mess that up, or if that corn plant's not happy, we can never make that back up. Doesn't matter how much more fertilizer or water we put on, you get one shot at that title. Then as we move on to flowering time period, just past tassel, that's the period where I was talking about where we're going to be using upwards of 50% of the total crop needs for that corn plant. So another time period is very critical. And then past that, moving on into grain fill, we'll talk a little bit about water during grain fill period in just a moment. So I talked a little bit about determining how many rows are around on that ear. And that happened about that V6 growth stage. So not very big corn, but obviously we want to be taken care of. And that ear really helps us determine what went on in that corn plant's life. It's like a diary for that corn plant's life. It really helps us to figure out, okay, if we had some problem, we can look at that ear, we can oftentimes tell how much stress was on that plant, what time period of growth stage it happened to be at. So this would be a picture of one way we can do that. And if you look at this picture, this is a microscopic picture. This would not be visible with the naked eye. And this would be at about V9, so just past that critical growth stage that I mentioned a minute ago. And so what you can see here is that the rows around have pretty well been determined by this point. But the tip of this ear, and everything on a corn plant, as far as the ear goes, development-wise, starts the butt of the ear and moves towards the tip. So we're not fully developed out here with rows long, but we are with rows around. So that's what we didn't want to mess up. So hopefully we've been able to keep that thing with enough groceries underneath it, with enough water on it to keep it happy. As we move a little bit further out into this corn plant's life stage, you can compare that microscopic ear with another microscopic picture at about V12, or 12 true leaves. So we're getting some height on it. We're just before a few growth stages before we start to push the tassel out. And so one thing you'll notice on this is that we have went ahead and established the total number of ovules that are going to be on this corn plant, both around and long. And something critical that happened at about that V7 to V10 growth stage is that these number of kernels around went ahead and doubled. And so you can see this picture here of how these ovules have doubled. Each one of these ovules will potentially turn into a kernel if it's fertilized later in the season. And so if we cut ourselves short, whether it be water, whether it be nutrients, whatever it may be, there's stress on that crop around that critical time period that I mentioned, then we may not get all of these to double. Or maybe a portion of the ear won't double. And that can be due to, like I said, lack of moisture. That can be due to lack of fertility. That can be due to a misapplication of a herbicide. So a lot of management has to go in to making sure we set ourselves up for success. Because once again, if this does not happen, we can't make up for that with any more water or any more fertilizer. There's no magic snake oil we can pour out on that thing to increase our yield at that particular time. So we're going to have what we've got. So we've talked a lot about bell curves today, and some people that really love them, some of you out there probably don't. But it's a fact. Everything happens on a curve like this. And so corn is no different as far as its water use. And this is just showing different growth stages and how much water we're going to be using on average, general trends for a corn crop. And so what you can see here, this would be that critical window, the most critical time period for that corn crop to be happy and have enough water on it is right there around flowering. So once we start to push a tassel, start to shed pollen, trying to fertilize that ear, whenever we're using upwards of 3,500s in a hot, dry year, it's windy, maybe 4/10 a day during that time period. So we've got to have a plan there to make sure that we can supply that crop with as much water as we can up to its needs at this given time. So if we don't have the well capacity to do that, then we need to make sure that we've got some in the soil that it can pull from. So pray for rain. Or have Mr. Bledsoe do something for us to bring us some rain. So crop evapotranspiration, we actually heard a little bit about this earlier in the day today. It's probably worth going over again, especially when we talk about scheduling our irrigation based on ET and crop removal. Evapotranspiration obviously is going to be very, very high whenever it's hot and dry and windy. Well, that's usually our growing season, right, for the most part. Cloudy, cool, and calm days obviously are going to reduce the amount of evapotranspiration that happens. So maybe we don't have to supply that crop with as much water on a given day. But seasonal evapotranspiration is also affected by growth stage. Like I showed you before, it's going to be taking up a whole lot more water during that flowering time period than it is early in the season or later in the season. So some numbers that were pulled from Hale County, and these are just some averages. It's not from last year. It's not from this year. Just really don't get lost in the numbers other than the fact of when we get more rain, what months we get more rain than others. And so this is going to vary, obviously, depending on where you are in the country. At this particular location, the majority of the bigger rainfall events actually occurred during our growing season. So May, June, July, August, September. as we look at October, November, December, January, and February, those rainfall events get smaller in the amount. So as you think about what crops you grow in this particular region, obviously there's a reason that we grow summer crops. We can hopefully capture more of this moisture that we receive in the summertime there, and we'll kind of touch back on this here in just a little bit. Show you why that's important. So looking at a period of just a little bit over 100 years and all of the rainfall events that happened during that time, looking at the amount of rain that we caught in each one of those rainfall events, you can see that by and large, the majority of those rainfall events are less than a quarter of an inch. And so very few of our rainfall events in this part of the world happen at 1 to 2 inches. Now this is over 100 years worth of rainfall data, so this is not taking into account what we saw last year, obviously. So what can we do to make sure that we utilize these small rainfall events more efficiently? Well, that may mean doing things like more of a conservation type tillage practice. Whatever it may be, things that we can do to capture the majority of our rainfall events is going to benefit us greatly. So how does planting date affect crop water use? So we might think that if we plant a corn crop in April, it's going to use X amount of inches to get so many bushels. Compare that to May, June, or July planted corn, you would think in theory that it should use the exact same amount. We'll see here, this is data off of the TAWC website. So what Bob showed you and how to get into that website, how to use that, all this data was pulled directly off of that. So I think it's very, very good data, very useful. And putting it into a format like this, for us, really helps us visualize at what point in time are we needing the most moisture, and all the inputs that you can put into that model that are specific to your farm, for your operation, really give us a good idea of what we can do management-wise. What crops should we be growing? When should we be planting them? Do we have enough water to do what we want to do? These models will really help you see that. So just some examples here. So corn planted on April 15th, giving it 100% of the water that it would need. We're at a pretty high amount. Total replacement of 100%, a little over 34 inches. So don't get scared off by that. So I'll show you some other examples as well. But this will be a full season hybrid planted early. Now as we move into May planted corn, we can see that our total ET went down. So we were at 34.5, we're more at 31.3, okay? So it takes a few inches less. One reason so, the later we plant, the faster that crop's going to come out of the ground, the quicker it's going to get from one growth stage to the next. And so we can utilize a little bit less water doing that. But you still see these curves, our highest water use out here during that flowering period. So as we move into June planted corn, so June 10th, still 100% ET replacement. You can see that we dropped that total water needs down to 27 inches, a little over. And so we'll talk about some reasons why this may fit into your particular scenario here in just a moment. So one thing that myself and other team members within Pioneer in this part of the world have looked at pretty extensively over the last couple of years has been split planting scenarios. And these split planting scenarios, you may be very familiar with it, and maybe you've been doing it for a long time. I've talked to a lot of guys that haven't really thought about doing that, or maybe haven't really got to figure out how they can manage different crops, different maturities. And so we'll talk about some of those scenarios as I go forward. But as we talk about split planting, this may mean that you're sharing water between two different circles. And maybe you're planting one crop on one and a different crop on the other. And really the name of the game is to try to maximize the water you've got and put all of your resources on one crop right whenever it needs that water the most. Because we're assuming that we don't have enough water to take care of it all. So we break it down into looking at your main crop and your companion crop. And that can look very different depending on how you're set up. But we want to plant our main crop first and make sure that we can take care of that. And then adjust our companion crop, whether that's milo or whether that's a cotton crop or whatever it may be, or a corn crop, and adjust that maturity, adjust that seeding rate to where we're hedging ourselves that if things get bad, maybe it's more of a dry land type scenario or limited irrigation, but we can still make grain on that. We'll go through some of those scenarios in a little bit. But that may mean keeping 100% of the water on your primary crop to go ahead and take care of it. As far as our companion crop goes, Brent talked earlier about seeding rates in sorghum, specifically dry land seeding rates or limited irrigation seeding rates, and how, by and large, in my opinion, a lot of our milo is planted pretty darn thick for those situations. And Brent showed how we can rein some of those seeding rates back on milo and still achieve optimum yield. So that's something that we can think about doing there if our grain sorghum is our companion crop. So just to show you some numbers to keep in mind, and you're probably very familiar with this since all of you are an irrigated agricultural country, but just to give you an idea about gallons per minute per acre and how that translates to acre inches per day and acre inches per week, because as we go through some of these scenarios, we may look at what we're putting on that crop. So you can kind of think back to this chart and say, well, if I'm talking about a quarter inch a day, it's somewhere between 4.5 and 5 gallons per minute per acre that we're going to need. So I'll show you a few scenarios, and these are going to vary depending on what you're set up to do, what you want your main crop to be and your companion crop to be. But I'm going to have corn in the mix of all these, since this presentation is about corn for the most part, but how do our other crops fit into this situation? And so when we look at early planted corn, which I mentioned to you earlier, that was our highest water use, and then also late planted cotton. And so I believe it was Bob talking earlier about late planted cotton, and you may have a disagreement with him or the statement that I'll make, because I'm just piggybacking off of him. But May 25th, May 27th, kind of the late time period to be getting your cotton in. His data showed still about 2.7 bales to the acre. So a very feasible scenario here if that's your companion crop. What we see is that you want to look at the top of this curve, of this bell curve we heard so much about today. So peak water use for both of these crops, they're split apart, and that's the main thing. So being able to look at that data off the TAWC website and say, okay, if my planting dates are different, if my crops are different, can I allocate the majority of my water to one crop and get it through that time period where I don't want it to stress? And then, as the water use comes down of this corn crop, that's whenever it's really ramping up on this cotton crop. And so we can allocate more of our resources towards that crop. So that's a scenario that, in my opinion, works very well. So what about early cotton and late corn? Now, depending on your well capacity, this may be something that fits into your scenario very well. But as we heard earlier, 60% ET replacement for cotton is a pretty good sweet spot to be at for water utilization and ultimately yield. In corn, 75 to 80% is usually where we like to keep it. So it's going to be a little bit higher. So while this may fit into your scenario depending on how much water you've got, or whether you've got one circle that's split, or whether you're sharing water between two different circles, this may or may not work for you. The part that, once again, you've got to keep in mind is that peak water use for both of these crops is happening at a pretty close time period. And so depending on your well capacity, this may or may not be an option that you would like to pursue. But this gives you a visual before you go out there and go ahead and do that. Say, okay, well, maybe I want to stagger those planting dates out a little bit more. So here's an example of early corn and late sorghum, which works very, very well. I've had quite a few guys doing this. ET replacement on sorghum, using a figure of 60%, on corn still 75%, but you can see that taking care of that corn crop early on, making that our main crop, focusing our resources on it for the first part of the season, we can achieve very, very good yields by doing so, making sure that we can take care of it during peak water use. And then as peak water use starts to come down and we're using very little water, that's whenever peak water use is really ramping up and we're at that critical time period in grain sorghum plant's life. 10 days before boot, 10 days after boot, somewhere in there. So a couple more scenarios and we'll move on. So how does early corn and late corn look? Worked with a lot of guys in the last 2 years specifically that have used this scenario that wanted to grow corn, or were 100% corn guys. And early corn, late corn, I think works very well. If you look at the model, once again, these curves show us that peak water use, we can split those apart. But we want to make sure that we're doing things like changing up the maturity. So if we're going to plant something, a early season hybrid, say 103, 105 day hybrid in April, and then we're going to wait 30, 45 days, plant something fuller season, or you could even switch that if you wanted to, but the name of the game is just making sure that we are staggering the flowering dates, getting them as far apart as possible, because we know that's when the crop is going to be using the most water. So if we can stagger those flowering dates by switching up planting dates, maturities, and maybe even adjusting the seeding rate of this later planted corn crop to a little bit lower if we expect lower yields. Just matching the seeding rate to the amount of water we're going to have is going to be very important. But this is a scenario that's very, very doable that we've had a lot of guys have a lot of success with over the last couple of years. So how do we do all that? You know, I talked a little bit about matching your seeding rate to the amount of water you've got, to the planting date, whatever that may be. You know, as precision ag moves forward in all crops, and we're able to variable rate seed and things like that, variable rate apply on fertility. In-depth understanding of soil types, I think, is critical. You may say, well, we've got predominantly the same soil type across our whole area. And that very well may be true for when those soils were mapped. My father-in-law mapped a lot of soils in the 70s. And I'm not going to cuss him in public, but we've gotten better at characterizing these soil types over the years. And so maybe it all was a sandy loam or a sandy clay loam. But we can characterize those a little bit better today than we could in years past to see, okay, chemically, can that soil hold more nutrients? Can it hold more water physically? Should we be farming side hills a little bit differently than we are the low spots or the flat spots? So an in-depth understanding of your soil type, I think, can go a long ways. You know, I mentioned variable rate seeding, variable rate fertility applications. You know, variable rate irrigation is not too terribly uncommon in a lot of parts of the world now as well. So being able to manage each soil type and also manage different crops that are on that is going to be very important and very doable as well. So we look at the different soil types, just in general as far as buckets goes, comparing sands to loams to clay loams. Obviously we've got different moisture holding capacities of each different soil type, and I don't expect you to read all of this, but you know, obviously the big bucket items that you should know, you know, permanent wilting point, the point of no return essentially of that crop. But looking at water holding capacities, and then what portion of that water holding capacity is plant available in inches of water per foot. And so specifically, when talking about the predominant soil types that are in our area, and maybe your farm differs a little bit, you can find it on here, but fine sandy loams and silty clay loams, you know, we're blessed with very good soils. We're just not blessed with enough rainfall in our part of the world. So very good soils, very deep soils for the most part. But knowing how much plant available water is out there so we can irrigate accordingly and knowing how to check for that, obviously very important. Reasons why, looking at a corn plant's root structure and its growth habit. So 40% of the water is taken up in the top 25% of the rooting depth. So you can add these together. 70% of the water that a corn plant takes up is in the top half of its rooting depth. So very little of that is coming from the very bottom of the soil profile and the very bottom of the total rooting depth. So you can picture it this way, maybe gives you a little bit better visual of that. So early on in the corn plant's life cycle, before it hits reproductive time period, it is still in rapid growth phase, and still in a vegetative state. You can see the effective root zone somewhere around 2.5 feet or so, give or take. I mean, this is obviously going to vary depending on soil type, depending on how you watered it, depending on the amount of nutrients that were there. Later on in the growing season, once we hit reproductive time period, we get virtually no root growth in a corn plant after that. So you've pretty much got what you've got. But you can see that later on, we're better than 3 feet or so, sometimes up to almost 5 feet, depending on a hybrid. But they're going to be tapping the moisture, though, predominantly 70% of it's going to come in this top half. But it brings up the point that we do need to make sure that our watering early on in corn plant's life cycle, where we're not giving it too much water in the top portion, and we're training those roots to go and explore more soil area to find more water. We don't want to grow a great big plant that's got a shallow root system. So I saw quite a few fields this last year, just in the early season, heavy rainfall, where we were pretty shallow rooted. And the corn plants never had to go below this deep to find enough water early in the season. And then whenever we did turn off hot and dry, we didn't have enough root mass really to tap into more moisture. So that can lead us to a big problem later in the season. So I'm going to show you some data that I'll try to explain to you, so don't get hung up in looking at a lot of different things. I'll walk you through it. I've got to give credit to one of our research scientists that's actually in the back of the room, Corey Mills. He now works for Bayer, but this project was his baby, and very instrumental for Pioneer's understanding of corn water use, how our more drought-tolerant corn plants utilize water. And so this is truly groundbreaking information as Corey was working on it. And so I'm going to go over some of this data, and I think you'll appreciate it as well. And you may have seen a little bit of this at some of our other meetings as well, but I think it's worth going over again. So we've heard a lot about ET replacement today, and so what this graph represents, this red, would represent 100% ET replacement. So we're giving that corn crop every bit of water that it needs. The blue line would be 80%, this green is 55, and this orangish yellow would be 45. So as we would expect, 100% replacement gets us the most yield, in theory. But if you look at the gap between 100 and 80, it's pretty narrow, and it drops off considerably between 70 and 55. So that's why oftentimes a very efficient ET replacement rate to use is somewhere around that 80 mark if you can't provide 100% replacement. So these research plots were in a very controlled environment on drip tape, so we could control exactly how much water was put on that crop and exactly when it needed to have it put on. And so by doing that, we're able to induce stress on this corn plant's life at certain time periods, at certain growth stages. So not only did we do just straight ET treatments, but also looked at this 65 GFS. That would be this right here. That's grain fill stress. So post-flower, after flowering, just in the grain fill period, this plant was stressed. Up until that point beforehand, it had a replacement of 65% of its needs. This line here would be 55% replacement, but we stressed it early on in its life cycle. So as I talked about that V6 growth stage, somewhere in there, the crop was up, it was established, and then stress was induced. And then we kept it happy, or happier, with 55% of its needs, and then stressed it late in that grain fill period. And then the last treatment down here, where you can see the yields are definitely depressed, and that's the main story of this slide, is that's stress during that flowering period. So flowering stress obviously hurt us worse than anything else, especially compared to early stress and then late stress. Flowering stress compared to grain fill stress, we definitely see the most detriment during flowering time period. So if you've got to not water a crop, the flowering time period is not when to do that. So I'll walk you through a few of those treatments. And so what we've got here obviously is highlighting Aquamax products, so our more drought tolerant products, compared to our traditionally bred corn hybrids. And so the blue and the green would be Aquamax hybrids of different maturity. The yellow line would be traditionally bred products. And so you can see at 100% ET replacement, there's not a whole lot of separation between these. One thing that we heard about in Bob's talk was certain cotton varieties that performed very well in drought conditions didn't perform as good as he'd like to see them under fully watered conditions. That's a challenge that we have in breeding corn as well. We want to make sure that it's very defensive, but if it turns off and it rains, or we're able to put more water on it, that we're not capping ourselves as far as yield goes. And so this would show us that our breeders have achieved that within the hybrids that we tested, because this Aquamax product was able to yield just as much, if not more, than a traditional product that had all the water it needed. At 80% EP, very similar story, not a whole lot of separation there. That's what we would expect. So as we move on to looking at less water supply, so 55% replacement, we can see that our Aquamax products are starting to have a little bit better yield than our traditional products. Okay? So you can see there's getting to be a little bit of separation there. Now we see a whole lot more separation with the more stress that we induce on that crop. So when we look at a 40% replacement right here, we can see that this gap widens. Now, not only did it answer that question for us, but it really helped us figure out, okay, well, if we've got that much water and we can only supply a crop with 40% of what it needs, what seeding rate should I be at? And so you can see from these curves that even at a 40% replacement, to achieve the most yield, not the most dollars per acre, but the most yield, we're somewhere around 25,000 plants per acre, even with that little water. So economically, the seeding rate was somewhere back around here. But yield-wise, still around 25,000 plants per acre. So we can compare the 55% replacement with 60% replacement, but stress induced during grain fill. So once again, in both of those scenarios, we can see the gap really widen between Aquamax products and traditionally bred products. Definite benefit from those Aquamax products. And grain fill stress, obviously, like I said earlier, the most detrimental to a corn crop is when it's in stress during the flowering period, not the grain fill stress. And so we'll see that here in a moment. But you can definitely see these widen and the benefit of those Aquamax products. Now I'll talk about the flowering stress. And you can see a rapid decline in yield, really in all products. But we were able to hang in there a little bit longer with Aquamax products compared to traditionally bred products. When that crop was stressed early and then stressed late, which would be this treatment here, not as detrimental to overall yield, but you can still see a good degree of separation between Aquamax products and traditionally bred products. So this is definitely a scenario to avoid, if at all possible, stressing that crop during that flowering time period. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about nitrogen use, and then tie that into how it affects our water use efficiency. So it's been proven that nitrogen definitely increases our water use efficiency. And some data that I'm showing you up here would be from IPNI, or the International Plant Nutrition Institute. And I don't know if you're familiar with that group, but they do a lot of good fertility work in a lot of parts of the world, have a lot of nice manuals that are very cut and dry, showing you nice trends like this. And so this would be their data. And so what I want to show you is how nitrogen was able to increase our bushels per inch of water applied. And so we've got this broke down into more of a dry year and more of a wet year, 100% rain-fed in this case. And so looking at low to no nitrogen applied compared with 150 pounds, in a dry year, still a dry year, we're able to increase our bushels by 39. In a wet year, increase that by 56 bushels. So what that amounts to is a difference of 2.66 more bushels per inch of water applied in a dry year and 2.30 bushels more per inch of water in more of a wet year. So optimum fertility rates can definitely improve not only our yields but also our water use efficiency. Now there's a big assumption in this that all of your other nutrients have been met. This is just relating to nitrogen in particular. But being that it is our biggest input as far as fertility goes, I think it's worth talking about. So as we talk about fertility, and if you remember back when I was talking about those different split planting scenarios, how we may want to spread the number of days between that flowering time period, how can fertility change that, or can it? And at first glance, we might not think so. But there's been a lot of work done, especially in starter fertilizers and pop-ups and things like that. As they've gained popularity, we've seen that we can speed up a plant's number of days until flowering by the use of a good starter fertilizer program. Well, a lot of that may be due to early on, if we're going to plant our main crop as corn in one of those scenarios, and we're a little bit cooler, a little bit wetter, a good starter program can get that corn plant up and get it churning a whole lot faster. So we can reduce the number of days it takes to get to flowering by 7 to 10 days pretty easily with a good starter fertilizer program. And that's been proven. Dr. Barney Gordon did a lot of nice work out of K-State and proved that. So that's another way that we can use fertility to help widen the number of days between flowering to help us allocate more water to one crop versus another. So optimum fertility definitely can help us stretch our moisture out in the ways I just mentioned. We can produce more crop per inch of water with proper nitrogen management. Also helping us explore more soil volume, send our roots deeper into that subsoil if it's got the nutrients it needs to help find more water later in the season. Thicker canopy, getting us to canopy closure sooner, helping us reduce the amount of solar radiation that's bouncing off of that soil or drying that soil. And better vegetation, helping slow that runoff, just as we talked about with stubble and things like that, helping us infiltrate more water. Having a better plant out there is going to reduce the amount of runoff if we do get some of those heavier rainfall days. And, also let's talk about canopy closure, helping us control the amount of weeds that are popping up there as well. They're going to be robbing moisture and nutrients. So a quote from IP&I the day that I showed a minute ago: the greatest yield increase in fertilizers, percentage-wise, frequently occurs in years of moisture stress. I think it's something to keep in mind, and it's not always in a wet year when you be thinking about our fertility program, but those dry years is very, very important, as we saw how it can increase the amount of bushels we get per inch of water applied. So nitrogen management has definitely changed over the last few years. And as we've bred newer hybrids to do things like handle drought stress better, handle diseases better, whatever it may be, the amount of nitrogen that a corn plant takes up in its life cycle has shifted a little further out in its life cycle. So don't get hung up in the numbers here, because the moral of this story is that older hybrids took up less nitrogen later in the season than our hybrids do nowadays. And I'll show you some reasons why. And why that's important. If we look predominantly in a lot of fertility programs, and we're blessed in this part of the world that we can fertigate, so that helps us out. We spoon feed our crop a lot better than other parts of the country that aren't able to do that. So that helps us out in our efficiency greatly. But we can see that there's a big gap here between this red line is nitrogen available and this green line is how much we need. And so historically, we would have thought that somewhere around this flowering time period, the corn plant has taken up everything it needs nitrogen-wise. Like I mentioned before, what we have found is that we still need about 35% of the total nitrogen needs to be taken up after flowering. Well, this graph will show that, and all these different colors are just how that plant has proportioned nitrogen into different portions of the plant. But once we hit reproductive time period, we've only taken up about 65% of the total nitrogen needs of that corn plant. So we better have at least some reserve in the soil, or be thinking about putting on some more through irrigation or however you can get that on, upwards of 35% later in the season. So there's all kinds of different fertility practices, and the more efficient we are, the less nitrogen we can put on and still achieve optimal bushels. And so specifically looking at a few pictures here, just to finish up, talking about late nitrogen and its importance. This field had nitrogen applied late, around the brown silk stage. This had none. Obviously there was a definite need for it. You can see that these are a lot bigger, a lot girthier, and look at the stalk health there. Definitely predisposed to some fungal diseases, and plant health is not near as good. Different treatments that we've been looking at, so 0 pounds, post-tassel all the way to 90 pounds, and you can definitely see the benefit there. This is running short of time, I'll go ahead and finish up. So in summary, I think the key points there, management practices to think about, residue, how important and how beneficial that can be for us if you're able to incorporate that into your management system, whether it's no-till or strip-till, some form of conservation till to help reduce the amount of runoff, better infiltration and what have you. Planting dates and planting rates, obviously to be matched according to what kind of water we've got and how you want to time that out. Irrigation timing, the ET approach that we've heard from several speakers today, phenomenal way to be doing that. Proper fertility balance, definitely key to water use efficiency and making sure we're managing it right. So with that, we're just about done, so if you have any questions.